Hey folks, you might have noticed a theme in the last few videos. Nvidia cards in the 100 to 130 quid odd price range, duking it out to be the best value, budget orientated card at the start of 2019, but something offering even better value and even better performance as the GTX 970 and the 1060 in its sights, and it's ready to pull the trigger. Say hello to the XFX RX 580 4GB GTS, which I picked up last month for under £110, making it cheaper than both the 1060 3GB that I bought and the GTX 970 on the used market. Now, if you've seen some of the older videos on this channel, you might be aware that this isn't the first Polaris card that's came through the ranks. But when I seen this, a pretty decent looking RX 580, fully boxed and with an awkward auction end time, among a sea of other Polaris cards that have flooded eBay lately, I set about making sure that I got it. It's less than 6 months old, receipts included, and £25 less than what I paid for the GTX 1050 Ti last year. How times have changed. Now, if you're not familiar with the RX 580, then it's essentially a refresh of AMD's previous RX 480, with slightly more refined manufacturing, enabling slightly higher clock speeds. The card itself is based on the 4th generation GCN, Graphics Core Next architecture, which made the headlines in the legendary HD 7970 3GB. The card we see here comes in two versions, the 4 and 8GB, and unlike the GTX 1060 lineup, there is no difference in the GPUs between the different memory configurations. So what you get with any RX 580 is a 14nm Polaris 20 GPU, featuring 36 compute units, giving us 2304 SPs or stream processors, 144 TMUs or texture mapping units, and 32 render output pipelines. The official specs from AMD states a GPU clock speed of 1257 MHz and a maximum boost speed of 1340, although this XFX version ships with a slightly higher boost speed of 1366 MHz out of the box. The card, much like its contemporaries in the green team, uses GDDR5 memory, which is clocking in at 7 GHz effective speed on a 256-bit memory interface, giving us a nice and easy to remember 224 GB per second of memory bandwidth. Overclock and headroom on these 580 cards is a little bit more limited compared to Nvidia's Pascal range, but the card was completely fine with a modest overclock up to 1400 MHz on the core and running its memory at 8 GHz effective, which gave us a nice boost in memory bandwidth up to 256 GB per second. TDP on these Polaris cards is slightly higher than the Nvidia cards, and this one comes in at 185 watts, which means a single 8-pin PCIe power connector is required on this card. But raw specs, they don't mean much if it doesn't transfer into good frame rates, so let's boot up the same 6-core Xeon test station and see how this cheap and cheerful red team card stacks up against the GTX 1060 3GB, which was my pick of the bunch in the previous tests, and we're going to be able to see if that 10% extra cost on the GTX card is really worth it. Before that though, remember to use those thumbs and let me know what you think of this video, and please consider clicking subscribe if you've not done so already. The feedback is always appreciated, and it's been great to be able to incorporate a lot of your comments over the last year as the channel has started to grow. So let's just kick things off with Far Cry 5 at the high preset 1080p with TAA enabled, and we see the RX 580 actually edge out the GTX 1060 at both stock and overclocked speeds. It's close, but the narrower difference between the average and 1% lows on the red team card does mean a bit of a smoother experience. When overclocked, the GTX 1060 does match the average frame rate seen with the RX 580, but the percentile lows were between 5 and 10% lower, chalking up the first win for the red team. But as soon as we've clocked up the first win for the red team, we get our first loss in Rise of the Tomb Raider. Now this is a DX11 title, and that generally does perform better with Nvidia cards, and it's no difference here. Sure, the percentile lows are fairly close across the board, but looking at the average frame rates, it's a convincing win for the GTX 1060. Which kinda makes it all the more surprising when we look at the sequel, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, until we realise it uses the DirectX 12 API, and this allows the extra potential in the AMD card to be fully realised. Overclocking the GTX 1060 does see its 1% lows catch up to the stock clocked 580, but it's clear the RX card has the GTX card's number here, offering really impressive performance throughout the whole test. Now, Forza Horizon 4 at the medium preset, which is the preset I used to test the 1050 Ti, and as expected it returns a really impressive result for both cards, although I'm sure the actual result itself is something that some of you might not have expected. Both cards managed to average above 100 FPS at these settings, with the GTX card actually coming out on top by a whisker. Now, it's been well known that Forza Horizon 4 is actually really well optimised for AMD, and when we start to bump up the quality settings, the RX 580 does start to overtake the GTX 1060, and the higher settings we go, the more the gap between the two cards starts to open up in the AMD card's favour. Finally, Battlefield 5. The GTX 1060 3GB in stock form does manage to actually hit 60 FPS on average, and it has its 1% lows coming in at the low 50s. Overclocking gives it a considerable bump in terms of both average frame rates and percentile lows, but the RX 580 here, it takes the crown with over 60 FPS on the percentile lows even at stock speed, and these stock results on the Radeon card being much better than the 1060's overclocked results just makes it the much better card for playing Battlefield 5 on. A hugely impressive win here for the red team. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you probably seen where this test was going from a mile off. Indeed, a lot of you, and I genuinely do mean a lot, pointed out the fact that AMD based cards are simply the better option as we go into 2019, and you know what, I absolutely cannot argue with any of you in the slightest. The GTX 1060 and the GTX 970, they're still great cards in their own right, and if I was using one as a daily driver, I would be very happy. But if you're out there looking for something in the same price bracket as these cards on the used market, it would be pretty difficult for me to recommend you go green when the RX 580 offers more and more performance at an even lower price. And it's also worth mentioning the RX 570, which is also cropped up in the comment section in some of the videos last year, and if you can't stretch the cost of a 580, then that would also be a fantastic option. That card, it simply features the same GPU that you find in the 580, but it's slightly cut down with 32 compute units instead of 36, resulting in 2048 SPs, and a slight drop in texture mapping units down to 128. In essence, the RX 570 gives you the latest version of the same core configuration as you would have found in the old HD 7970. So you know it's going to be good. And a quick scan on eBay sees 570s going for around the £100 mark. So it would be reasonable to suggest you might even be able to pick one of these up for under 3 figures if you keep your ears to the ground. I could also go on about how FreeSync is just a cherry on top, but really the results speak for themselves. Looking at the results as a percentage of the RX 580, with the 580 giving us a 100% baseline, the GTX 1060 3GB would need to offer performance at least 110% of what we'll get in the 580 to justify that 10% higher price that you'll see on the used market. Sure, in a lot of older DX11 titles like Rise of the Tomb Raider, it might come close to that, but in newer titles, especially those using newer APIs, the RX 580 it just takes the crown. More performance, lower price, what's not to like? Going into 2019, the mid-tier and the low 3-figure used market is not just won, it's convincingly smashed by the RX lineup of cards. Now, there is a green shadow looming over everything as we go further up the price range, but I think that's perhaps a video for another time. And with that, I'm going to leave it there. As always, thanks for tuning in to watch this video. I'd love to hear what you think of this new resurgence of Polaris cards, and if you would consider buying an RX 580 today. For now though, take care, and I'll see you all in the comments section down below, and in the next video.